That night in a dark alley, they said only one word: laptop. Not money, not a phone, which meant someone tipped them off. I thought that was the end of our friendship, but when I found a pawn shop receipt in his desk drawer, I realized something worse. The end wasn't for our friendship. It was for me. The city was sleeping, or at least it was pretending to. Andrew walked half a step behind Leo, as he always did, as he was used to, as he probably couldn't do otherwise. The soles of their shoes beat a rhythm on the wet pavement of the San Francisco side street, a sharp, doubled sound that was the only thing breaking the pre-dawn silence. Streetlights reflected in the puddles as jagged yellow stains. 3 a.m. A few bars were still lit, but the patrons inside had gone soft, lost their shape. Of course, Leo was talking. He was always talking, even when there was no one left to listen. It was the story about Max and his failed startup, the one Max himself had torpedoed last year. Leo was telling it for the 3rd time this month, but with each retelling, he added a new detail, a new twist, a new intonation, making the story feel alive, as if it had just happened. His voice bounced lightly down the empty street, hitting the walls of the buildings and echoing back. Andrew was listening, or he was replicating the behavior of a listener with enough accuracy that Leo wouldn't notice the difference. He pulled up the collar of his jacket against the damp October air and glanced down at his hands. It was a quiet, almost mechanical habit, a way of making sure his hands were where they should be, that everything was under control. The strap of his backpack dug into his right shoulder, a familiar and persistent pressure he had felt throughout their walk. He adjusted it again, for the 3rd time. The laptop. 8 pounds of aluminum, glass, and 8 months of work. Their project, which Leo called our one shot, and Andrew simply called the project, avoiding the drama. It was an algorithm for analyzing large text arrays that, according to Leo's calculations, could be sold in 6 months for enough money to move into an apartment that didn't overlook a grimy air shaft. Andrew wrote the code. Leo handled the negotiations with potential buyers, whom he found with the same ease he found new friends at parties. He wasn't supposed to bring the laptop to the party tonight. The thought flickered and was gone. He pushed it away. He'd brought it because he planned to work at Leo's in the morning, which was logical, reasonable. No other explanation was needed. "Hey," Leo said, stopping at the intersection so abruptly Andrew almost ran into him. A wide smile, the streetlight catching golden flecks in his brown eyes. "Let's cut through the alley. I'm sick of taking the long way around." Andrew looked in the direction Leo pointed. The alley gaped between 2 buildings, dark, narrow, with a smell of dampness he could sense even from here. To the right was the well-lit street, their usual route. An extra 7 minutes, maybe 8. A steady, predictable path along the yellow stains of the streetlights. "We could just take the street," Andrew said. His voice was even. He was surprised himself at how steady it sounded. "It'll take longer," Leo threw back over his shoulder, already taking the first step toward the dark opening. That casual tone meant the question was closed before it was even asked. Something pricked at Andrew, a dull, non-specific feeling. Not fear, or not just fear. It was more like a signal the mind receives and immediately flags as irrelevant. Andrew was skilled at cataloging his feelings. He'd done it his whole life, filing them away on imaginary index cards. He would have labeled this one an anomaly without sufficient grounds for action. By then, Leo was already dissolving into the alley's darkness. Andrew took a step forward. Because a shadow follows the sun. Not because it wants to, but because that's how physics works. They hadn't gone 30 feet. The 2 men appeared out of the walls. That's exactly how it felt. They didn't emerge from a doorway or step out of the shadows. They seemed to peel away from the very bricks, soaked in dampness and grime. Black hoodies, ski masks, Their movements were unhurried, lacking the jerky haste Andrew would expect from a street mugging. One of them blocked the path ahead. The second stood behind, cutting off their retreat. Simultaneously. The word lodged itself deep in his mind, settling like sediment at the bottom of a glass. He didn't have time to process it, only to feel the alley shrink, becoming tighter than it was a second ago. The one in front of Andrew didn't deliver a monologue. He didn't immediately pull a weapon. He made a subtle motion with his chin, down toward the backpack. Then he said a single word. Laptop. The voice was toneless. A tool. A screwdriver. A hammer. Not angry. Not scared. Not triumphant. Just functional. Andrew didn't move. Not money. Not his phone. The laptop. Specifically the laptop, not the backpack or everything you have. The word cut straight through him, reaching a quiet, cold place inside that nothing usually touched. They knew. They had come with a purpose. They had come for a specific thing. Andrew only had time to think that. Then everything stopped being sequential. Leo exploded. He didn't scream or jump back. He lunged forward, not at the man in front of Andrew, but at the one blocking their escape from behind. It was a move without hesitation, without the half-second pause that precedes any normal person's decision to start a fight. "Andrew, run!" His voice tore through the alley's silence, sharp, full of rage. Yet there was something directed about it, too precise for a man who had just been threatened. But Andrew didn't run. The second attacker reacted quickly, deflecting Leo's charge with a short, professional block before spinning him around and pinning him against the wall. In that time, the first man calmly reached for Andrew's backpack. The fabric tore. The strap snapped under a specific calculated jerk. It wasn't ripped off, but released, as if by someone who understood the mechanics of the buckle. Then came a dull sound, short, dry, and Leo's cry. A knife blade flashed once in the dim light from the end of the alley and was gone. The blow landed in his left shoulder. Leo slid down the wall, clutching the wound. The attackers vanished. They didn't run. They disappeared into the darkness with the same synchronicity they had appeared with. Andrew heard their fading footsteps for 3 seconds. Then, nothing. The alley was just an alley again. Dirty pavement, the smell of damp, the quiet drip from a rusty downspout. Andrew stood frozen. The backpack was gone from his shoulder. Something warm and sticky was on the fingers of his right hand. He looked down. Leo's blood. He must have grabbed his shoulder as he was sliding down the wall, though he couldn't remember when. Leo looked up at him from the ground. His face was pale, but his gaze was focused, almost calm. Too calm for a man who'd just been stabbed. "Call 911, he said evenly. Andrew reached for his phone. The hospital corridor was bathed in a special kind of light that exists only in hospitals and interrogation rooms. Fluorescent even, and merciless, casting no shadows. This light allowed nothing to hide. It exposed the cracks in the linoleum tiles, the smudges on the walls, the fatigue on the faces of people shuffling by in rubber-soled slippers. Andrew sat on a plastic chair against the wall, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His right thumb was mechanically rubbing his forefinger, a small, monotonous movement he didn't notice. The police officer across from him, a man in his late 40s, with the face of someone who had seen enough to no longer be surprised, finished taking his statement. A sheet of paper, a pen with a chewed cap, a standard form. Andrew answered the questions mechanically, their route, the time, a description of the attackers. 2 of them, ski masks, dark clothes, medium build. He knew the description was useless. The officer slid the form into a folder. "Your friend is one of a kind," he said, his voice weary, but with the sincerity of a man stating something he truly believed. Not many people would jump in front of a knife for a friend like that, without a second thought. A real hero. Andrew looked up. Yeah, he said. The officer gave his shoulder a brief, paternal squeeze and walked away, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking faintly. Andrew watched him go, watched him turn the corner. Without a second thought, the words hung in the air, suspended like dust motes under the fluorescent lights. Andrew lowered his head. His fingers resumed their rubbing, thumb against forefinger, forefinger against thumb. He forced them to stop. He laid his hands flat on his knees, motionless. 13 years. He had known Leo Orlov for 13 years, ever since their first week of college on the steps of the arts building where Leo stood telling a story to a group of strangers as if he'd known them his whole life. He had studied Leo the way one studies a rare, complex text, methodically, patiently, with an eye for detail. He saw things in him that others missed, not just the charm, but the mechanics of the charm. Not just the generosity, but the mathematics of it. Every one of Leo's gestures was precise. Every word was calibrated. It was beautiful, like a complex algorithm or a well-written piece of code. He had become Leo's archivist, storing his stories, remembering details Leo himself forgot, without a second thought. The corridor hummed around him. A gurney clattered out of an elevator. Behind a set of double doors, a heart monitor beeped softly. A nurse walked past without a glance, a coffee mug in her hand. Andrew replayed the alley scene again, not chaotically, not in a panic, but methodically, frame by frame, like an editor scanning for inconsistencies. Leo had lunged at the attacker blocking their escape, not the one directly threatening Andrew. From the standpoint of protecting Andrew, it made no sense. The first attacker was closer, the immediate threat. That's who you would charge if your goal was to defend your friend. But Leo had gone for the one at the back. Why? He'd yelled, "Run!" But Andrew couldn't have run. The way out was blocked. The knife wound in the shoulder, not the chest or the stomach. An angled blow that guaranteed tissue damage, pain, and blood, but missed every major artery and vital organ. Andrew was no doctor, but he'd read enough true crime to know the difference between a wound that kills and one that impresses. This was impressive. He realized his thumb was moving again and stopped it. He rose from the chair, paced a few steps down the corridor, then turned and walked back. He knew it was pointless, but standing still felt worse. The detective had meant it as a compliment, a testament to a man's highest quality, the ability to act on instinct. A hero doesn't calculate. A hero just charges ahead. But Leo always calculated. Every single time. For 13 years, there hadn't been a single decision he'd made without calculation. It was just that his calculations were so fast, so deeply integrated, they looked like impulses. Andrew had always seen it. That's why he was the chronicler, not a disciple. He didn't admire blindly. He observed and understood the mechanics. Or thought he did. He sat down again, the fluorescent light humming a low, steady drone above him. They had been waiting. The attackers were waiting for them in that specific alley on that specific night. Laptop, the first and only word spoken without tone or explanation. The laptop. The one Andrew was carrying, hidden inside his backpack beneath layers of fabric. Something no stranger could have possibly seen. How did they know? The question formed slowly, like a crack in tile, starting from a single point and spreading outward, unstoppable. He pushed it down. He filed it away in the part of his mind reserved for things requiring more data before processing. Now was not the time. Now was for the hospital, the police statement, Leo in surgery. Analysis would come later. That was how his system worked. But the question didn't go away entirely. It remained, quiet, cold, and uncomfortable, like a shard of glass in the sole of his shoe that hadn't yet broken the skin, but made its presence known with every step. 3 days, each one the same. His phone on the nightstand buzzed in waves. In the morning, it was colleagues and acquaintances he barely remembered. In the evening, it was close friends, which made the replies doubly difficult. The messages were all variations on a single theme. How are you holding up? What Leo did, it's just incredible. A true friend. Hey man, I heard. How are you? Leo's a total hero. You're lucky to have him. Andrew's replies were short. I'm okay. Yeah, I'm lucky. Thanks. 3 words, 4 at most, enough to end the conversation without raising concern. He would put the phone down, stare at the web of cracks on his apartment ceiling, and wait for the screen to go dark. The first day back from the hospital, his apartment greeted him with the cushioned silence he usually cherished. The old clock ticked away the seconds. The hardwood floors creaked under his feet just as they always had. But something had shifted, subtly, like the angle of light when a cloud drifts over the sun. On the second day, he found himself standing in front of his bookshelf, staring at the spines without reading a single title. He just stood there. For 7 minutes, he checked the time, because even for him it was an abnormal pause. On the third day, Leo called. His voice was bright, almost cheerful, with that particular, slightly theatrical energy people use when they want you to know they're doing much better than expected. Andrew, he started, after a brief pause. How are you holding up? I'm fine. Good. Another pause, this one more deliberate. I'm just lying here. It's boring, honestly. The food is disgusting, and the TV in the room has been blaring since 6 in the morning. Andrew listened, closing his eyes. Hey, listen, Leo continued. Could you swing by my place? My phone charger should be on the desk, and there's a book I left on the windowsill. Michael Connelly paperback, blue cover. I've got nothing to read here, and it's driving me crazy. Okay. You're a lifesaver. His voice was warm, almost tender. You remember the code for the front door? I remember. He hung up and looked at the phone in his hand. It was an old model, the corner of the case scuffed from years of use, but Andrew was used to it and had no plans to replace it. The screen showed the date, Thursday, 11 in the morning. The thought of entering someone else's apartment when they weren't there pricked at him with a sense of awkwardness. It wasn't forbidden. He had the building code and a spare key Leo had given him long ago. Just in case, you know? Andrew knew. He always knew. It took him 40 minutes to get to Pacific Heights. A ride on the Muni, a transfer, then a walk up the hill. The October sky hung low over the bay, a solid sheet of gray. The new residential complex rose above the street with glass-paneled walls, reflecting the gray sky and doubling its bleakness. The elevator, the 8th floor, a door with no nameplate. Leo's apartment greeted him with the scent of sandalwood and leather, the quiet, persistent aroma from a diffuser on a shelf by the entrance. He'd always seen the interior as an extension of Leo himself, cold and beautiful, with no unnecessary details. Polished concrete floors, white walls, a glass table on chrome legs, abstract paintings in thin frames, which Leo had bought 2 years ago from an acquaintance. A good investment, he'd said at the time. Not, I like it, but an investment. Andrew had noted it then, but attached no significance to it. Now the space felt like a stage set. Not a home, but a showroom window. He walked over to the desk. The charger was right where Leo had said it would be, next to a laptop. Not his laptop. Leo's laptop. A slim, silver MacBook that was usually open. Now it was closed. Andrew picked up the charger and looked around for the book. The Connolly paperback with the blue cover was on the windowsill, just as Leo had described. He picked it up, holding it in his other hand with the charger. His gaze drifted back to the desk. The left drawer was ajar by half an inch. Not closed properly, pushed in carelessly, or left open intentionally, which would have been uncharacteristic for Leo. In this apartment, nothing was ever out of place. A tablet controlled the lighting. Art books were stacked with surgical precision. The built-in closets had no handles. The open drawer was a glitch in the system. Andrew set the book and charger on the desk. He pulled the drawer open. Beneath a few sheets of paper, a printed contract, a couple of business cards, lay a small rectangle of thin thermal paper. Andrew picked it up with 2 fingers. A receipt from a pawn shop. He unfolded the slip of paper slowly, as if it were fragile. The font was small but clear, the lines short. The date, Tuesday. 2 days before the attack. The item, a laptop. Make, model, serial number. The client's name, Leo Orlov. Andrew read it again, more slowly this time. His heart didn't skip a beat. That would be too elegant a description for what happened. For a moment, the feeling that his body belonged to him simply vanished. His hands held the paper, his eyes read the words, but a fracture had formed between the action and his awareness of it. The laptop. Not just any laptop. The specific one that had been taken from the alley. The one the attackers had come for. The first and only word spoken in the dark. He folded the receipt, put it back in the drawer, and pushed it shut. He picked up the book and the charger. He took a step toward the door and stopped. He stood in the middle of the room, knowing his feet wouldn't move any farther. Not because they couldn't, but because leaving now would mean pretending. Pretending he hadn't seen it. Pretending that 3 lines on a receipt could be dismissed as a coincidence and filed away on a high shelf with all the other things that made life difficult. He returned to the desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out the receipt again. This time he read it differently, not rushing, not looking for a loophole. The date was clear, Tuesday. He remembered that Tuesday. He and Leo had talked on the phone about the party. Leo had called first, suggesting they meet at Kate's place in the Mission. "Bring your laptop," he'd said. "We can head straight to my place to work afterward." So Andrew had brought the laptop. On the same day, Leo had pawned it. Andrew leaned against the desk, the concrete floor cold even through the soles of his shoes. Beyond the panoramic window, San Francisco lay under a gray sky, alive and oblivious. The bay glistened below like dull steel. The alley. He replayed it in his memory again, but not like he had in the hospital corridor, not searching for inconsistencies. This time he just looked at the completed picture and let it be what it was. Leo suggesting the alley, the attackers appearing simultaneously. And the second attacker. He remembered how the man had held Leo, not slammed him against the wall, not with the brutal force he'd felt himself. He had held him, restrained him. His movements weren't about attacking, but containing, his hands placed just so, ensuring Leo couldn't break free and accidentally ruin the performance. The knife had gone into the shoulder, the left one, at an angle. It was a wound for an audience. He slowly exhaled. 8 months of work. He had written the code, built the algorithm's architecture, and fixed every bug Leo found during demos. Leo had handled the negotiations. Leo had called the potential buyers. Leo knew what their project was worth because he was the one leading those talks. He had sold what belonged to both of them, and then staged an attack to emerge from the story not as a thief, but as a hero. so the theft would look like a random mugging, and no one would ever think to look in another direction. The mission he had come on, the good, caring, reliable friend, the one who was a lifesaver, dissolved like sugar in hot water, quickly and without a trace. He looked around the apartment one last time. The concrete floor, the white walls, the abstract art as an investment. Everything in its place, everything calculated. A stage set. That's why he'd never felt at home here. It wasn't his introverted nature. It was because nothing in this apartment was real. He slipped the receipt into the inner pocket of his jacket and zipped it up. The elevator carried him down. The doors opened to the cold October air from the bay, the scent of the water, the low sky. He stepped out of the lobby and stopped at the curb. The hospital was a 20-minute drive away. He pulled out his phone and looked at the map. The route was familiar. He'd driven it the first 2 days, sat in the corridor, brought fruit. He had done what was expected of him. He hailed a cab and gave the address, watching the city drift past the window, indifferent and wet. Bridges, avenues, the sterile architecture of the civic center, signs he didn't read. He wasn't thinking about what he would say. He wasn't rehearsing. That would be too much like something Leo would do, words as tools, phrases as positions on a chessboard. Andrew rode without a plan, with only a single question inside him, unspoken, but solid as a steel rod. The cab stopped in front of a gray building with a sign that read, St. Francis Memorial Hospital. He paid and got out. The glass doors of the emergency entrance admitted him along with a gust of cold air. The smell of disinfectant and medicine hit him immediately. The shuffle of slippers in the hallway, the yellow glow of the fluorescent lights. He pressed the elevator button, waited. The receipt lay in his inner pocket, small and irrefutable. Andrew kept his hands in his jacket pockets, calm, still. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors slid shut. The 3rd floor corridor of St. Francis Memorial was long. He knew this from his second visit. 42 steps from the elevator to room 8 if he walked at a normal pace. Now he was walking slower, and the hallway seemed to stretch with every step. The linoleum floor was cold under his shoes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a monotony that eventually ceased to be a sound. The receipt was a burning weight in his pocket. An hour ago, in Leo's apartment, it had felt physically hot through the fabric. The moment the picture had clicked into place, a kind of clarity had switched on inside him, cold and pure like distilled water. He had pocketed the receipt and left without the bag containing the book and charger. But now, that clarity was gone. 28 steps to the room. The smell of antiseptic grew stronger. What if he was wrong? The thought drilled into him with a quiet persistence. The serial number on the receipt matched the model of the laptop taken from the alley. He had checked it from memory, twice back at the apartment. But memory wasn't proof. He hadn't written the number down, hadn't taken a picture. He just remembered. And memory, as he knew better than anyone, was an unreliable archivist. Maybe Leo had an old laptop of the same model that Andrew simply didn't know about. Maybe the receipt had been sitting in that drawer for months. 23 steps. The corridor split. A treatment room to the right, a restroom to the left. Andrew kept walking straight ahead. His fingers tightened around the receipt in his pocket, feeling the resistance of the thin paper. A small rectangle. A few lines of text. He was about to walk into that room and present it to Leo. Leo, who had spent 5 days in the hospital with a stab wound, who had looked pale and weak just yesterday when Andrew had brought him oranges. If he was wrong, their friendship couldn't be repaired. 17 steps. The door to room 8 was slightly ajar. Andrew paused in the doorway for a second before entering. The room was flooded with the sterile light of the hospital, faded seafoam green walls, a metal frame bed, a nightstand with a chipped corner. A bouquet from a mutual friend sat on the nightstand, carnations, already starting to droop. Through the window, he could see a sliver of gray sky above the brick wall of the next building. Leo was lying on the bed, not sitting up, not scrolling through his phone with his usual speed. He was lying back against the stiff pillow, his right arm on top of the blanket, his left shoulder hidden under layers of bandages and a hospital gown. An IV tube ran from a plastic bag of solution to a vein in the crook of his elbow. There were dark circles under his eyes, not from fatigue, but real, bruised-looking hollows. His normally tan skin looked ashen in this light. Andrew watched him for 3 seconds. Something about the image, the fragility, the stillness, the IV drip, struck him in the place where, just an hour ago, a solid structure of facts and conclusions had stood. The structure wavered. This was his friend. 13 years. A man who had taken a knife, a real wound, real pain. And that fact was irrefutable, regardless of whose script had been followed. His fingers loosened their grip on the receipt in his pocket. To go in and ask meant he had no room for error. Just then, a nurse entered the room. She appeared from the side, a woman in her 50s with tired but not indifferent eyes, a blue pen clipped to her white uniform. She was carrying a new bag of IV solution, moving with a practiced, unhurried gait. She saw Andrew in the doorway and smiled. "Are you here for Mr. Orlov?" "Yes." Come in. She walked past him to the bed and began changing the IV bag, her hands moving with an automatic grace. "It's good that you're visiting. He gets bored in here, you can tell." Andrew stepped into the room, stopping by the door. The nurse attached the new tube and checked the connection. Without turning around, she said quietly, in the tone of someone stating the obvious, "You have a wonderful friend. Not many people would do something like that these days." A small pause. A real man. A rare kind of person. Andrew watched her hands working with the IV line. A rare kind of person. That was the 3rd or 4th time he'd heard that phrase in 5 days. The nurse gave the IV one last check and left, pulling the door closed behind her. The room fell silent, save for the steady, monotonous beep of a heart monitor in the next room. Leo opened his eyes. "You came," he said. His voice was quiet, a little hoarse, not for dramatic effect, but in the way a voice sounds after days of hospital medication. "I'm glad to see you." He offered a weak smile. The corners of his mouth lifted, but it wasn't the broad, controlled smile Andrew knew. Andrew didn't move. He stood a few feet from the bed, his hand in his pocket, fingers resting on the folded receipt. The whole scene, the paleness, the IV, the bandage, the quiet voice, was contained within 60 square feet of sterile space, with its peeling paint on the window frame and linoleum stained beyond cleaning. How easy it would be to take his hand out of his pocket, empty. To ask, "How's the shoulder?" To sit in the chair by the nightstand. To accept the version of the world where Leo was a hero. Andrew pulled his hand from his pocket. The receipt was in it. He walked to the nightstand, moved the chair that stood against the wall, its legs scraping against the linoleum, but didn't sit. He carefully unfolded the receipt with both hands, the way one presents a formal document. He placed it on the white surface of the nightstand, next to the glass of water and the wilting carnations. He took a step back. He said nothing. Leo's eyes followed his hand as it laid the paper down. Then his gaze shifted to the receipt and stayed there for several seconds. Andrew watched his face with the professional scrutiny of an editor searching for a single inconsistency in a text. Not a muscle twitched. There was no shock, No rapid blinking, none of the telltale darting of the eyes that precedes a lie. Leo looked at the receipt as if it were something he had been expecting to see. Then he looked up at Andrew. His eyes held an expression Andrew couldn't immediately classify. Fatigue, yes, but something else. Not fear, not shame. Something like the relief of a man who has been carrying a heavy weight and has finally set it down. The silence between them stretched on. The heart monitor beeped from next door. Distant, muffled voices echoed from the hallway. Leo spoke first. "I knew you'd figure it out," he said, his voice even, almost toneless. "Sooner or later." He said it without regret and without challenge. It was a statement of fact, like an analyst noting that his projection had worked, with only a minor deviation from the plan. Andrew remained silent. He waited. "Yeah," Leo said, looking at the ceiling, then back at Andrew. "I sold the code, and the mugging was a setup." A pause. "I needed the money, fast. It was the cleanest way to get it without being connected to the theft. No trail. A random mugging. The cops don't investigate. The insurance pays out. Everyone feels sorry for you." He laid out the scheme calmly, his voice businesslike, as if describing a deal that had gone according to plan, except for one variable. That variable was standing in front of him, holding a receipt from a pawn shop. Andrew had expected something else. He had spent 20 minutes in the cab, not rehearsing words, but imagining the contours of the conversation. Denial, then pressure, then maybe anger or tears. Not this. Not this calm report, delivered without a hint of remorse. The project was worth a lot of money. Leo gave a slight shrug with his uninjured shoulder. "You wrote the code, I handled the negotiations. I found the buyer. My work was worth just as much as yours." "Half of it was mine," Andrew said, his voice quiet and steady. "It would have been, yes, if we'd sold it officially." Leo looked back at the ceiling. "But officially means taxes, contracts, questions. This was cleaner." Andrew could hear the logic. From the inside, it was flawless. It was the logic of a man for whom clean and right were the same concept. He drew a breath, preparing to say something that had been accumulating for 5 days, a mixture of guilt, doubt, and the horror of his own understanding. Something short and precise. But Leo beat him to it. He pushed himself up on his good elbow, the IV line tightening. His gaze was no longer tired. It was focused. "Don't look at me like that, like I'm some kind of monster." His voice had a new, steely edge to it, quiet but unmistakable. A short, calculated pause. "You would have done the same thing," Leo said, "if you were in my position." It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a provocation. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a man who knew he was right. Because he had his reasons. Andrew froze. The righteous anger he had carried all the way from Pacific Heights, in the cab, down the linoleum corridor. It all vanished. Not faded, but evaporated, instantly, leaving behind a void. And in that void was a question as sharp as a shard of glass. Leo settled back onto the pillow. His expression was neither tired nor calm now. He was looking at Andrew with the same look he got during their poker games, rarely, only when he held an unbeatable hand. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who already knows the outcome. Andrew stood, motionless. 4 seconds. 6. He had come here to accuse. He had come with proof, with the receipt on the nightstand, with 13 years of observation. You would have done the same thing. How could Leo know that? Or did he not know? Was he just guessing, bluffing, pressing on a weak spot he'd intuitively found over 13 years. Andrew looked at him, unable to distinguish one from the other. Leo's face gave nothing away, calm even, with a faint, almost invisible confidence at the corners of his mouth. A look that demanded no answer because the answer was already known. The receipt lay on the nightstand between them. The words he had been about to say crumbled before they reached his tongue. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because a crack had formed inside him, right where his certainty should have been. A narrow, cold fissure running straight down the middle. He was standing before the bed of a man with a knife wound and an IV drip, who looked at him like he was holding a royal flush. And he realized, slowly, at the speed with which one grasps uncomfortable truths, that Leo wasn't just defending himself. Now, Leo's gaze held something different. Andrew had seen that look for 13 years, at their friend's poker table, in negotiations with people who thought they knew who they were dealing with. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a subtle shift at the corners of his mouth. Not a smile, but the premonition of one. The tell. Leo took a breath for his next line, a slow, deliberate inhale that was itself a form of pressure. Andrew recognized the rhythm perfectly. The pause before the final argument. He slipped his hand into his other pocket. Not the one that had held the first receipt. The right one, the inner pocket he hadn't touched since leaving Leo's apartment. The movement was small, quiet, no theatrics, just a hand sliding into a pocket, fingers finding a folded slip of paper. Leo stopped, not out of fear, but because this calm, controlled gesture was something that broke his script. He had expected the accuser, tense, tight-lipped, vulnerable in his righteousness. Andrew took out the slip of paper. It was folded in 4, just like the first one, the same thin, thermal paper. He unfolded it without rushing and placed it on the nightstand next to Leo's receipt. They lay there side by side, 2 white rectangles on the chipped surface of the nightstand. A small, absurd diptych. Leo looked at the second receipt with the expression of a man reading a document and struggling to make sense of the words. Then he understood. The laptop. The same model. The same serial number. The client's name, Andrew Peterson. The date, 3 days earlier than Leo's receipt. Andrew wasn't looking at Leo. He was looking at the 2 receipts side by side, the way an editor examines 2 versions of the same paragraph, methodically, without emotion, comparing. The laptop was insured, he said, his voice even and low, for a sum that would have covered 3 times its value in case of theft. I was planning on collecting that insurance. A pause. Someone walked past the door in the hallway. The footsteps faded. That's why I insisted on having the laptop with me that night. He stated it as a fact, without inflection. No excuses, no accusations. Leo didn't answer right away. Andrew finally looked at him. Leo's face had changed, not dramatically, but like the surface of water when the wind suddenly dies. The faint, barely there confidence at the corners of his mouth was gone. It wasn't replaced by fear or anger. It simply vanished. Leo looked at the second receipt, then at the first, then at Andrew. In his eyes, Andrew could read a chain of rapid, almost mechanical calculations. Leo was assembling the picture just as Andrew had in the hospital corridor a few hours earlier. He was checking the logic, searching for flaws, and finding none. 3 days earlier, Leo said. His voice was steady, but it had a new texture, something rough that wasn't there before. 3 days earlier, Andrew confirmed. The heart monitor beeped from next door. You were planning to fake the theft yourself, Leo said. It wasn't a question. Yes, and I beat you to it. Andrew didn't reply, No reply was needed. Leo leaned back against the pillow slowly. The IV tube tightened, then slackened. He stared at the ceiling, at the same cracks in the paint Andrew had stared at 3 days ago. A long pause. Not a theatrical one, a real one. "So," Leo said finally, and his voice held something like dark, reluctant admiration. "You just ran out of time." "You were just faster," Andrew corrected him. "And more creative. The wound was convincing." Leo let out a short, mirthless chuckle. Andrew looked at him, at the pale face under the fluorescent light, at the bandage hiding his shoulder, at the IV drip with its slow, monotonous rhythm. Minutes ago, this image had seemed like a threat. A man who held a secret, a man with a winning hand. Now he saw something else. A mirror. Not metaphorically, literally. Another person who had done exactly what he had planned to do, only first and with greater skill. The anger, the pain of the last 5 days, all of it crumbled. He had been planning something worse. To defraud his own insurance company and keep all the money for himself, cutting out the partner whose work the money was for. The only difference between them was the sequence of events. It was an uncomfortable, sharp, and utterly sober realization. Andrew didn't fight it. He simply let it take its rightful place. "Your plan was simpler than mine," Leo said, his voice regaining its usual smoothness, but the note of control was gone. "The insurance angle is cleaner. No accomplices, no knife." "No risk," Andrew added. "But no heroism either." Leo looked at him. A new expression appeared in his eyes. Not warmth, not coldness, but something in between. Recognition. "You weren't going to hurt me," he said. "I wasn't in your plan at all." "In your plan, I was a prop," Andrew replied. A pause. "Yes," Leo agreed. That yes sounded different from his previous words. It was stripped of its analytical detachment. It was just a fact, stated without a protective shell. Andrew looked at the 2 receipts on the nightstand. They lay side by side, 2 documents certifying 2 plans that had collided and annihilated each other. He felt no relief, no satisfaction. There was no sense of victory. He understood the arithmetic too well to call this a win. He had come here with evidence to expose Leo. Instead, he had exposed them both. The moral high ground he had carried in his pocket had dissolved the moment he'd laid down the second piece of paper. "You're not going to the police," Leo said. Again, not a question. "No." "And I'm not either." "No." They both knew why. It didn't need to be said. Andrew looked at Leo one last time, a long, careful gaze, the kind he usually reserved for a text needing a final edit. 13 years. College, San Francisco, countless parties and conversations, the project, the night in the alley. It all now formed a new configuration, and Andrew understood that this configuration had been the correct one all along. He just hadn't wanted to see it. He turned and walked to the door. In the hallway, the light hit him. Bright, fluorescent, shadowless. He paused at the door to let his eyes adjust and heard voices. "Andrew!" It was Kate. With her were Max and someone else he'd seen at parties but couldn't name. They were walking down the corridor with bags of fruit, their faces etched with that specific blend of concern and anticipation people wear when they are bringing aid. "How is he?" Kate asked, squeezing Andrew's arm. Her gaze was warm, almost solemn. "Is he holding up?" "He's holding up," Andrew said. "We were so worried about both of you." Max clapped him on the shoulder. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay. Thank God." Kate shook her head, as if she had personally endured the ordeal with them. "Leo is just... You know, people like him don't exist anymore. They just don't. I think about what he did, and I still get chills. The nameless acquaintance nodded. A real man. You were incredibly lucky he was there with you that night. Andrew looked at their faces, sincere, open, without a single hidden layer or calculation. They saw a simple story, an attack, heroism, a friendship tested by crisis, a beautiful story, an understandable one. He thought about what would happen if he tried to tell them, not the whole truth, just a part of it, that the attack was staged, that the wound was calculated, that he himself was not entirely a victim. He imagined their faces, confusion, then disbelief, then that look people get when they decide someone is not quite right in the head after a trauma. Yeah, Andrew said. Lucky. Kate smiled at him, a look of relief and warmth. Go home and rest. You look pale. Outside, October greeted him in all its San Francisco gloom. Wet pavement, a low sky, the smell of the bay hanging in the air. He stopped at the curb. The crosswalk was 20 yards away. The light turned red, and cars flowed past in a silent, wet, impersonal stream. He watched them without seeing a single one. 2 receipts were lying on a nightstand in room 8. He had left them there, both of them. He thought of Leo, of the look in his eyes when he had understood. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition. The light turned green. Andrew didn't move. He thought about 13 years, about what had held them together, not friendship in the way Kate and Max understood it, not shared interests or similar personalities. They were polar opposites. Not loyalty or affection. It was something else. He had found it in the moment he'd placed the second receipt on the nightstand. Their bond was built on a dark, unspoken knowledge of each other. Each saw in the other what no one else did. Andrew had always known that behind Leo's charm was a cold calculator who turned people into resources. And Leo had always known that behind Andrew's passivity was a man capable of the same, just more quietly. This knowledge had never needed words. It had never been an accusation. It was the foundation. The pedestrians next to him started across the street, and Andrew moved with them. Somewhere at the end of this route, his apartment was waiting. Tomorrow he would go back to work. In a week, Leo would be discharged. In a month, this would all become a story their friends would tell at dinner parties, and they would nod and say, yes, he was lucky to have a friend like that. Andrew stopped at another intersection. Red. Cars. He watched the traffic and thought about the last simple thing he had understood today in that hospital room. Their friendship had never been built on trust. It was built on a balance of dark knowledge. Each of them knew exactly what the other was capable of, not because they had confessed it, but because they recognized it in themselves. This understanding had never been a weapon, until tonight. It had simply existed as the background, a silent agreement. I see you, you see me, and we both prefer not to speak of it. The light turned green. Maybe that's what you call close. Andrew crossed the street.